Hello, everyone, and welcome to the joint CEPR, ICMB, and Peterson Institute event for the launch of the Geneva Report 23. It's all in the mix, how monetary and fiscal policy work or fail together. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, but also proud to be a distinguished fellow of CEPR. And this is, I believe, the fourth or the fifth year in a row we are working with the International Center for Monetary and Banking Studies and the Center for Economic Policy Research to present the Geneva Report. This year is on, of course, as always, a critical topic at the intersection of finance, monetary economics, and policymaking, how we bring together monetary and fiscal policies. This has been a source of great contention through the years. 40 years ago, roughly, started to be the revolution on central bank independence, where central bank independence in many ways was defined by the separation, the enforced separation of monetary and fiscal policies. And it was such collaboration was seen as suspect. That was challenged from the start, and increasingly in recent years, it's become apparent that some forms of monetary and fiscal cooperation are not only optimal perhaps, but increasingly necessary as the combination of secular stagnation, low interest rates, and the pandemic have shown us. And so after years of the G7, G20 communiques asking for fiscal policy to take over from monetary ease, we now have fiscal policy in a sustained and large scale way. And the question is both for the sustained part, how do we manage the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy, and going forward, what should be the regime to govern this interaction? So we're delighted that under the editorship of Ugo Panizza, the CEPR and ICMB commissioned this year's Geneva Report on the World Economy. We have four distinguished authors in the best spirit of the Geneva Reports. They bring perspectives from the private sector, from academia, from public policy in the official sector and central banks, and come together in a way across Europe and across the world. Today's authors are Giancarlo Corsetti of Cambridge University, Elga Bartsch of the BlackRock Investment Institute, Agnès Bénassy, professor at the University of Paris I and Paris School of Economics, presently at the French Treasury. But I should note that Agnès completed her contributions to this report prior to her joining the Treasury, and Xavier Debrun of the National Bank of Belgium. We also have two scholar practitioners on the macroeconomic and financial side to offer their comments on the Geneva Report. My colleague Jason Furman, professor of the practice at Harvard University and fellow at PIIE, and Benoit Cœuré, head of the BIS Innovation Center, but also affiliated on the board of the ICMB. So we are not giving just biographies of these people because we want to hear from all six of them and then from all of you. One note on that, we are using Zoom as well as broadcasting on YouTube. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose a question, which we will come to after the discussants' presentations. Please do not use the hand raising function because we already have over 400 participants and I'm not going to sort through that. So with that in mind, please allow me to turn over to Giancarlo Corsetti and Elga Bartsch, who will present the 23rd Geneva Report, how monetary and fiscal policies can work or fail together.
Okay, I guess you can see the screen. So thank you very much, Adam, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to present the report in front of the distinguished audience of the Peterson and to receive comments from two outstanding discussants. Elga and I, we share the presentation. I don't need to repeat what Adam said, which is basically the motivation for this report. So the idea that, monetary policy is the sole instrument for stabilization, this idea has been challenged. We know that our economies are not as resilient as we thought. Fiscal policy is back, but it would be a mistake to think of fiscal policy replacing monetary policy. What is really the time to think about is the time of how we think about the policy mix, rethink how the instruments interact and combine combined in providing a position. Now, clearly, relative to the time in which the theory of the policy mix was for. So when we sort of go back to the classics, having in mind a fundamental question, which is our economists are definitely confronted with tail risk. This is the risk coming from large exogenous disturbances, but also similarly moderate shock that they grow large because the policy instruments cannot be combined to provide a convincing response. So policymakers are unable to prevent adverse loops and destabilizing market behavior that endogenously magnify these disturbances. So we read the classic, having in mind this idea of what can we learn from them about the policy mix in this new context. Now, in the report, we contrast the classical view of fiscal monetary policy as strategic substitutes, which prevail when there is enough policy space to stabilize the economy, with a new view where policy space is constrained and the monetary and fiscal authority needs to exploit their strategic complementarity, which does not only mean that they need to push in the same direction, counter-cyclical, but they also need to act as to preserve space, policy space, and credibility of instruments. So here again, how we combine cooperation with instrument and institutional independence. We'll end up, as I told you, with an idea about, thinking about how we can go back to a great normalization of the policy context, and using an image from Okyun. How can we bring policies back to the middle of the road? So in this next slide, I'll summarize what you find in the report about our reading of the classics. Part of the answer the classics give to our question, how do we rethink policy mix in the current context, is well known. Just use as many instruments as possible, not be afraid of activating new instruments. And in the classical view, indeed, it's always crucial to keep track of how many instruments objective are you pursuing, although all the instruments interact and affect all the objective, you want to ask yourself which instruments are better assigned to which objective in terms of their effectiveness and efficiency. But in the classics, there is also much more. For once, all the classics insist on the idea that policymakers must take care of preserving the effectiveness of their instruments. So every policy mix has in itself the seed for either enhancing or hampering the overall policy space for stabilization now and in the future. Classics are adamant on this point. If you read Tobin, for example, it's very careful to review under which conditions an effective mix you can rely on effective mix. And it's very strong on the idea that you need to preserve instruments or independence of independent instruments. And in his view, this requires actually independence of policy decision-making. So he's actually adamant in favor of independent monetary policy. Also, through Tobin and conversation with Bill Brainerd, we ran into a small gem by Arthur Okyun. Okyun used to say in his lectures that a good policy mix must stick to the middle of the road. And here a quote from Tobin: in the middle of the road, there is ample room for variation in the interest of demand stabilization and other objectives. Another reason is risk avoidance. We can be more confident of the effect of policy instruments where they are not moved away from the actual experience. So the way we bring this lesson forward to our thinking in the report is to reflect on strategic substitutability and strategic complementarity of instruments. So the best known formulation of substitutability is the Tobin funnel. So the idea that both monetary and fiscal policy feed nominal spending, P by Y, they did not be both counter-cyclical, because less of a fiscal can be substituted with more from the MTAP in adding to aggregate demand. Tobin, however, is also very clear in his teaching that although both M and F feed nominal spending demand from the top of the funnel, the split between inflation and economic activity is when demand splashes on, so to speak, on the aggregate supply. And of course, monetary and fiscal policy are relevant also at the aggregate supply level, are relevant contemporaneously, but in Tobin's view also over time. So his theory that you can always achieve the same level of aggregate demand with loose money, tight budget, or tight money and loose budget, but the first one is more friendly to growth, external balance, and sustainability. Remember his role in discussing Volcker-Reagan policy mix. But here comes the idea of Okun, which is a good mix, keep instruments in the middle of the road. So the idea is that there is another dimension of this, which is a policy mix is never myopic. You need to understand that pushing an instrument to the corner may be over time eroding policy space. So I'll go quickly to condense what the evidence said in the chapter. In principle, you don't need both M and F to be both counter-cyclical, because again, they are substitute. But in the data, what we find is the clear evidence that the congruent policy mix, both instruments counter-cyclical, is the exception rather than the rule. It's pretty rare. And most often monetary and fiscal policy pull in different directions. This is fine in some cases because some shocks may require that. But it's very hard to think that it's all driven by particular shock, the procyclicality, extensive procyclicality that we see in the data. And clearly for fiscal policy, this is well known. Procyclicality is driven by political factors, financial constraint on the government. So one of the lessons is that, you are gasping for policy space, both because you are facing large shocks, but also because we let the past policy accumulate imbalances that are coming back as a revenge, as a vengeance now to reduce the space for stabilization. So this is our motivation for thinking more about complementarity, and I leave the floor to Elga.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. And let me also thank the Peterson Institute and Adam in particular for hosting us, and Benoit and Jason for agreeing to discuss our work. But importantly, I also want to express the thanks to my co-authors who made the journey through which we evolved our collective thinking on these matters so enriching and productive. Because when we started to work on the report, it wasn't clear how pertinent the question would become, and it wasn't clear what a massive leap in the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy we would witness due to COVID-19. And it seems that even today, the debate on the mix between monetary and fiscal policy remains very intense, and that views are still evolving, to no small degree due to the contributions of economists affiliated with the Peterson Institute, whether it's Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, or indeed Jason Furman. Now, after Giancarlo has set the scene by outlining our take on the history of economic thinking on the policy mix and what we can learn from this and presenting the empirical evidence, I will discuss the role of tail events in a little bit more detail. I will look at a number of examples of fiscal and monetary policy coordination, and I will draw some preliminary policy conclusions. And like my co-authors, I'm also speaking in a personal capacity on these matters. But in our view, the policy mix really needs to be understood in the context of tail risk. These tail risks challenge the standard mix, for instance, as we have seen at the zero lower bound. And such tail events can not just result from large exogenous shocks, such as the global financial crisis or COVID-19, but they can also develop endogenously from small disturbances if private sector expectations are not firmly anchored. And that's actually what is shown on the complementarities slide that we just saw. Agnès, if you could pull that up again, maybe for people to see how it all works. But essentially, what we are trying to show is that in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we've seen a number of encouraging examples of a stabilizing policy mix, despite some quibbles we can have about policy details or indeed the premature withdrawal of stimulus. But by and large, we concluded that monetary authorities managed to escape the liquidity trap or the danger of becoming powerless by resorting to a wide range of unconventional policies. But the policy mix can only be congruent and effective when monetary and fiscal policy are creating space for each other. And that's really the crux of the whole argument. Central banks need to ensure low borrowing costs, and effectively by providing a monetary guarantee on the nominal value of government bonds are allowing governments to borrow without the fear of belief-driven market dislocations hampering the rollover of debt. At the same time, fiscal authorities need to safeguard the monetary policy space by backstopping the central bank balance sheet and by committing to cover potential losses. This is essential because it prevents inflation expectations to become unanchored in a situation where a central bank moves into negative equity. And as powerful as the interdependence between monetary and fiscal policy is, leveraging it requires a really nimble approach. For starters, it requires to be open-minded about the need for such policy coordination between fiscal authorities and central banks, which is really, as Adam said at the outset, something that we have started to see only recently. But more importantly, after we have seen sort of this de facto coordination or ad hoc coordination evolving, especially in the wake of COVID-19, it requires a strong institutional framework going forward, a framework that equally backs a credible long-term commitment to price stability and to debt sustainability. And there are various ways one could think about doing that. One potential option would be a standing emergency financing facility, which I proposed in 2019 together with Stan Fischer, Philippe Hildebrand, and Jean Bovin. But there are other options as well. Because without such a solid framework, the monetary fiscal coordination can well go wrong. And it typically goes wrong for two reasons we learn from history. One, because governments fear to navigate the monetary fiscal interdependence and essentially deny its existence and end up with a wrong divergent policy mix. An example of such a situation would be the Euro crisis. Or alternatively, because governments fail to understand the limits of the interdependence and stretch central bank balance sheets beyond their breaking points. Argentina would be an example of this. Milder forms of policy coordinations are yield curve control policies, which some central banks already are conducting, while others contemplating various forms of it. In the report, we review the experience of both the US and the UK in the aftermath of the Second World War using yield curve control. And both episodes, but especially the one in the US, point to the risk of exiting the coordination too late, i.e. only after inflation has become a problem and only after an open conflict about central bank independence has broken out. So in the context of the current vulnerabilities to tail risks, we are concerned about the ongoing downward trend in the equilibrium interest rate level, R star. And if our star is this low or indeed potentially negative, central banks will keep hitting the zero lower bound. And that is something that we need to focus on, and it requires, because the continuous resort to unconventional monetary policies would blur the boundaries between fiscal and monetary policy even further. Moreover, as many have stressed, a low R star indicates some destabilizing inefficiencies where too many saving chase too little investment. That's a sign of economic malaise or secular stagnation, if you like, various imbalances, rising inequalities, which go well beyond stabilization policy. But also, if the downtrend in our star is not reversed, there's little hope to restore the economic resilience and to go back to effective stabilization policies. So in the report, we argue that increase in our star is a precondition for the great normalization of the policy mix and getting back to the middle of the road, as the concept that Giancarlo has introduced. We think that raising our star should really be considered a global public good like climate change. It is clear to us that beggar thy neighbor actions are self-defeating, not just ultimately, but also today. Trade protectionism, vaccine nationalisms are examples of this. And they create uncertainties that will further weigh on our star. And the current juncture of the sort of post-COVID policy reset, we think, presents a unique opportunity to overcome the problems created by today's constrained monetary policy instruments and potentially by tomorrow's constrained fiscal policy instruments in a world where public debt levels would be much higher than today. So bringing the policy mix back to the middle of the road would considerably increase the potential for effective stabilization policies and for countries to handle even large global shocks. And it all is in the mix, in the connection between the central bank that offers a monetary backstop to fiscal policy and fiscal policy that offers an effective backstop to monetary policy. And sort of each side needs to do their part, deliver their policies effectively. And that, in our view, are the key lessons from both the economic classics as well as the historical experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elga. And again, praise to you and your combination of co-authors, the editor, Ugo. It takes a village, and the fact that all of you were able in real time to change the course of your research and your analysis as practice preceded theory, as happens so often. Just let me nod to Xavier Debrun and Agnès Bénassy-Quéré. Do either of you wish to make a comment at this time, or you're comfortable with your co-author's presentation as I expected? Reminder to all who are listening, this is on the record. The event, the video, links to the publication, the slides will all be available on the CEPR, the PIIE, and the ICMB websites. Now let me turn to the first of our two discussants, Jason Furman.
Great, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this terrific and important report. I am in almost complete agreement on all of the economic analysis. Where I'm less certain is how it would apply institutionally, at least in the one narrow case I'm most familiar with, which is the United States of America. Let me just briefly underscore the important set of economic arguments here. Switching from monetary and fiscal policy being strategic substitutes to strategic complements is overwhelmingly the most important message. I think that message is important not just when interest rates are at the effective lower bound and the economy is still way below its potential, as is the case right now, but also will remain important going forward, as we saw inadequate demand even years after the financial crisis even after interest rates had lifted off in the United States and the UK, if not in the Eurozone. And that leads to what I think is the second just really important point that Elga ended on, the idea that raising our star is a global public good. And the fact that it's a global public good is a job for fiscal policy, not just in downturns, but in normal times as well. This is not something, I think their paper says, so I don't want to, I don't want them to have guilt by association, but that means using fiscal policy to increase demand might mean more deficits, but it also might mean fiscal policy that does more to expand pensions, increase support for college, and other ways to reduce the amount that households need to engage in precautionary savings. Let me now go to the institutional application of this idea. And what I'm saying, I'm reasonably confident applies to the United States, and it applies to varying degrees in varying other places. In Washington, D.C., you have three institutions. On 20th and Constitution, you have the Federal Reserve doing monetary policy. The other end of Constitution, effectively 0th and Constitution, you have the US Congress. The Fed is about the most rational institution in all of Washington, the most technocratic, the most sound. Congress, well, I think you get the point. It's at the opposite end of the spectrum. Somewhere in between those two, on 16th Street, sits the White House. And to some degree, it appoints people that work at the Fed, but then doesn't deal with them afterwards on how they set monetary policy. And it begs and pleads the Congress to do things. And occasionally Congress does something vaguely related to the begging and pleading. So I've often gotten the question of, now that Janet Yellen is confirmed as Treasury Secretary, which is terrific, fantastic, important, and wonderful, does this mean we'll see more monetary fiscal coordination in the United States? The answer is Janet Yellen doesn't set fiscal policy. I wish she did. It would be a wonderful world if she did, but the Congress does. And the Congress is not always rational about it, as evidenced by the fact that we had a huge stimulus in April, May, June, and July, then effectively no stimulus for August, September, October, November, December, and then a decent size one again in January. That doesn't reflect any rational policy. So if you have these two policymakers, this rational central bank and this irrational political Congress, how can they coordinate? Well, one way for them to coordinate is the central bank to become more political. We've seen that before. Alan Greenspan went to Bill Clinton in 1992 end of 1992 or 93 and said, if you do 500 billion of deficit reduction, I will cut interest rates and keep interest rates low and make sure the economy does well. So he became a politician. He sort of offered a trade. You do this on fiscal policy and you have to hit the number 500. You can't hit 499, and I'll do that on monetary policy. That was effectively coordination, but that involved the Fed becoming a bit more like the Congress. We had under Federal Reserve Chairman Burns, in effect, more coordination, and that involved the Fed becoming a political instrument to a greater degree of the White House than it normally does. So one opportunity for coordination is for the central bank to become more political. I think that's not what the authors are recommending. I think that in general is not desirable, and there's a bad history of it that ranges from moderately bad to terrible around the world. A second option is for the legislature to become more rational and more like the central bank. I don't think we're going to get the United States Congress to meet every 6 weeks, deliberate over the latest data, and come out with an adjustment in our fiscal stance. That's one of the many reasons why ideas that give counter-cyclical and inflation management responsibilities to fiscal policy, like MMT, make very little sense. So I don't think there's that much hope for that. What I think there is some hope for is to legislate ex ante better automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers that when the unemployment rate is high would automatically expand unemployment benefits, expand assistance to states and localities, undertake some fiscal action. And so, while the central bank is pursuing, largely discretion, not rules, tempered a bit by forward guidance, average inflation targeting, the like, but largely discretion, you could aspire to having fiscal policy have a little bit more automaticity to it, a little bit more of a rules basis to it. So I think that's the way you could get to the coordination, would be more around the rules than in any particular moment. I think even that would be limited. You can't build in as a contingency everything that could possibly happen in the economy. Congress is still going to be, for a variety of reasons, doing all sorts of things to fiscal policy. And so that leaves me with my conclusion that I think the highest aspiration in most cases for monetary fiscal is not coordination, but we should count ourselves as lucky when they're correlated. And for the most part, the correlation involves fiscal policy going first, deciding what it's going to do, and then monetary policy, understanding what fiscal policy just did, having a decent forecast of what it's going to do. Hopefully that forecast is informed by fiscal policy having more automatic stabilizers, and then monetary policy maximizing its objectives with respect to and subject to what fiscal policy is doing, which is different than saying monetary and fiscal policy will jointly be designed to maximize an objective. I think there's no way around that type of correlated action. That type of correlated action works well when fiscal policy is actually doing something resembling its job, taking some of the pressure off of monetary policy, some of the pressure off of our star. I think we've been closer to that mode over the last year than we have for a long time. I would love to see that spirit continue. If we could get more coordination ex ante around the rules with automatic stabilizers, that would be great. Greater coordination ex post is very hard for me to imagine unless it is done on the political terms of the White House and the Congress, with the central bank becoming more political. And I think that form of coordination, and I think the authors agree, would be undesirable and worrisome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think the American experience perspective is important, but also then we're already starting to get questions. The issue is, how do we apply the general principles the Geneva Report has done to various specific institutional contexts, not just in advanced high-income economies, but also developing economies, not just in federal systems or parliamentary systems. But before that, we are privileged to have Benoit Coeuré as our last formal discussant. Benoit, please.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this excellent report. Let me share my slides. And let me start by saying that there is a lot I agree with in the report, starting with the basic framework that in normal times, fiscal policy and monetary policy are what the authors call congruent. That is, they go in the same direction, but they don't really have to coordinate because they go in the same direction anyway, except when the economy is hit by some very weird shocks, like big supply shocks. When you're on the roadside, when you face extreme events, which is the case today, obviously, and still for some time, we'll come back to it, there is a scope for fiscal policy and monetary policy to empower each other. And there is a risk that they would undermine each other if you don't care. And I fully agree with that. And I also fully agree with one remark made by the authors, which is that this framework does not contradict in any sense central bank independence, because that's in the best interest of both parties. And in my comments, I would very much take the angle of the central bank in that discussion. And let me focus on the question which the authors are also addressing, which is, how do we go back to the middle of the road? How do we come back to normal? And here the authors discuss a number of avenues to go back to the middle of the road, and they all, by and large, amount to finding different ways to lift our star, so that monetary policy can come back to normal. And there are a number of options. Temporary monetary financing a la BlackRock are discussed, but not the prime solution. Supplying more safe assets, everyone would agree with that, but it's much easier to say than to do, even though Europe has made a baby step in that direction with the Next Generation EU program. The jury is still out how long this will last, and so it cannot be a short-term solution, and needs big institutional change in Europe. And so at the end, the authors are back to the notion that governments should exploit R being lower than G and invest wisely or spend wisely. And it's all music to the ears of many economists. I would totally agree with that, except that it's a little bit of an act of faith in government's ability to be star. So it assumes that all this money will be invested very wisely. I'm a little bit skeptical about it. I agree with the intention, but I'm not sure we should put all our eggs in that particular basket, that is putting all our hopes in the fact that governments are going to invest all this money in investment that will lift our star and get us back to normality in terms of macro policies. And for that reason, you can understand that the whole discussion creates quite a bit of anxiety among central bankers, certainly more anxiety than the report would suggest in terms of our ability to come back to the middle of the road. And why are central bankers so anxious? Well, I guess the fear that in fact we'll get stuck off the road and we'll never be able to come back. And why is there a risk that that the economy and the economic policy apparatus will get stuck off the road? That's because of debt. That's because of debt. Public debt and private debt are now so high, and that's a state variable. It's persistent. It's not going to. It's going to stay with us. It's not going to go down for some time. And there is high degree of concern among central banks that these large levels of public debt and private debt will create a risk of fiscal dominance. That is, as the authors of the report rightly point out, government debt needs central bank backing to be safe in circumstances such as today. And it's not only about government funding, it's about the functioning of the whole of the financial system, which relies essentially on public debt being a safe asset. It's all collateralized. You need safe government debt to make the system function. And central banks might just feel that whenever they start even mumbling, suggesting that they're going to normalize, the whole system will blow up because of higher interest rates and the public debt not being seen as or felt as safe anymore. And that's typical fiscal dominance compounded with financial dominance because all of the ramifications in the financial system. And I'm not talking only about banks and banks holding government bonds, which is a concern in Europe, but it's also about non-banks. We've seen in the spring when the COVID-19 crisis first hit the system, how fragile also market-based finance was to any kind of shock, including the treasury market as well. And so given this fragility, given this risk of fiscal and financial dominance, there is a fear that the current state of play, complementarity between monetary policy and fiscal policy would be entrenched for years, and it's going to be very difficult to move back to the middle of the road. And so what can we do about that? And here I want to strike a positive note, an optimistic note with 2 points. First point, and both points relate to the fact that central banks actually have a lot of instruments, and certainly more than the short-term interest rates. And the whole theoretical kind of premises that the report starts from, the classics, Timbergen, Mundell, Tobin, Okun. I mean, it's all very good to start from there, and it provides for a good framework. But it's all based on the assumption somehow that central banks only have one instrument, which is a short-term rate, and that fiscal policy and monetary policy are kind of either cooperating or competing along in the same one-dimensional space to support output using each of them using one instrument. But the world has changed. And the first argument I would like to make is that balance sheet policies, that is unconventional monetary policies, can actually help us move back to the middle of the road. And they might not be given full credit or enough credit by the report. Elga said earlier that recourse to unconventional monetary policies can blur the boundary between fiscal and monetary policy. And that is correct from a political economy standpoint. But using balance sheet policies can also help us make debt more sustainable. And that in itself will help us move back to the middle of the road. So to illustrate, I've used simulations made by some of my BIS colleagues, Boris Hoffman, Jenny Lombardi, Benoit Maujon, together with Athanasios Orphanides. And they have this small DSGE model where fiscal policy stabilizes debt and monetary policy follows the Taylor rule. And then they hit the model with thousands of shocks, and you can see the outcome on the right-hand side of the chart. And so normally, fiscal policy would stabilize debt, monetary policy would follow the Taylor rule, except that now we are stuck at the ZLB, at the zero lower bound. And so the simulations here compare three states of the world. One state of the world where there is no active fiscal policy and there is no unconventional monetary policy, no QE. That's on the top. That's the top chart, and you can see that debt is reasonably contained because there is no active fiscal policy, but also inflation can raise pretty high because central bank doesn't have this active unconventional policy. And when the government if you add active fiscal policy to it, but no QE, no unconventional policy, you have the second chart in the middle, and you can see that can be pretty efficient in terms of inflation, but you can see also that it can lead debt to very high levels because you have fiscal policy being very active, but the central bank does not act on the long-term rate. It only has the short-term rate to act. And so in many states of the world, you're stuck in this left top part of the chart, which is actually debt deflation, high debt and low inflation. And that's not a place where you want to be. And so if you don't want to be there, you can add quantitative easing. And if you add quantitative easing, so central bank will start bringing the long-term rate down, and that will help a lot curb the increase in debt. And you're back to this cloud of points here, where you avoid these excessive debt levels. And if you look very closely, you can even see that it's even better than the situation with no fiscal policy, no quantitative easing in terms of debt levels. The curve is flatter. So the message here is that active central bank policy, QE, by acting at the long end of the curve, not only at the short end of the curve, can help flatten the curve of public debt to GDP ratios. And in so doing, it can help limit the situations of fiscal dominance and financial dominance that I've just highlighted. It helps curb the increase in debt. It improves debt sustainability. It helps us come faster to the middle of the road. So that's the first positive point, which might not be highlighted enough in the report, that balance sheet policies, QE, is actually part of the solution, because it will in itself help curb the increase in debt levels and make it easier to go back to the middle of the road. And my other point, which is my last slide, is that there are many other instruments that central banks can do. And again, central bankers don't live anymore in a one-dimensional world. You can see this photo of Philippe Petit walking on a tightrope between the two towers in 1974. That's what a one-dimensional world looks like. It's very uncomfortable to be there, and you've got to be extremely careful because you only have actually two places to go, left or right? Which for monetary policy would mean short-term rate up or short-term rate down. It's a very narrow place to be. It limits your options a lot. But what we've seen throughout this crisis and starting also actually during the great financial crisis is that central banks have added a lot of tools to their toolboxes. They are controlling the short-term rate. They are controlling the long-term rate and the term premium using QE. They are moving into the credit world by buying corporate bonds. They can differentiate between different interest rates. The ECB lends money to banks through their TLTRO operations at a rate which is actually below its deposit facility rate, which is even outside its money market corridor, which would have sounded like science fiction only a few years ago. So you can use different rates, you can use different types of facilities, you can act on the credit premium, you can act on the term premium. And there is a lot more analytical work to do to understand the complementarity or the substitutability between these different instruments, and also to understand the relative impacts on the fiscal path and on the financial system, that is, their fiscal and prudential footprints. What I'm suggesting here is that these instruments have helped a lot on the way down. They're helping a lot today to stabilize the economy. They can also be used by central banks on their way up, on their way back to the middle of the road, to make sure, for instance, that they tighten financial conditions for the economy without sending the government debt market in a turmoil. That's something that you can do now that you have different instruments. So my suggestion here is keep an open mind towards using different instruments and try to be smart on the way up as you've been smart on the way down, and that can help limit the risk of being stuck on the side of the road, and limit the risk also that Jason very rightly highlighted of being stuck for so long on the side of the road that you're turning the central bank into a political institution. And you can make use of all these instruments to get back to normality faster. That is the hope I would like to formulate here. And I stop.
Thank you so much, Benoit. And again, Benoit, as well as the authors, slides, as well as links to the report will be available on all the various institutions' websites. We have 25 minutes left. First, let me turn to Agnès and Xavier. Would either of you like to respond to anything the discussants have said? Xavier says no.
Maybe just a few words to thank both discussants. I think it was really fascinating to hear them say what I interpret as being really nice things about the report. One thing I would like to emphasize is the extent to which I am in full agreement with what Jason said. I mean, Jason said, how can we coordinate better monetary and fiscal policy? And he said you have two ways. Either you make the central bank more political, and there are other ways. And one way to summarize the other way is to make the government less political, which is kind of a challenge when you think about it. He mentioned the case of the US, but in Europe, this is exactly what we've tried to do, to have some kind of better coordination between monetary and fiscal policy by making governments less political. And the way we've tried is by imposing fiscal rules, that is constraints on budgetary aggregates. And we've put them in an international treaty just to make sure that this was indeed binding. And, experience with those rules has proved that this is still very, very difficult, even if you think about all sorts of mechanisms to make those rules enforceable and so on and so forth. So I think at the end of the day, what I take from Jason's discussion is that we're faced with the immense challenge to constrain policymakers' discretions, in particular elected policymakers' discretions, in a politically acceptable way. And believe it or not, because one of my other affiliations is the European Fiscal Board, so we're advising the Commission on all sorts of things, including the design of new and better fiscal rules, if we can do so. This is really this is really complicated, and so I look forward to any bright idea coming from the discussion. And regarding what Benoit just said, again, it's I think that overall we agree, because at the end of the day, what we suggest as a way out is pretty much, at least as far as I understand it myself, similar to what we have argued. I wouldn't think that public debt is so much of a challenge. I think that when we start thinking about the way out to a higher R star and using or leveraging fiscal policy to do so, I think the main challenge is just to make sure that, hey, we want high quality fiscal policy. I mean, all those who argue in favor of a fiscal expansion to raise our star insist on the quality of fiscal policy. We must make sure that whatever public investment takes place out there is actually a good complement to private investment, because this is ultimately what we want to boost. And the other thing is that if you want fiscal policy to contribute to a reduction in precautionary saving, you really want fiscal policy to be predictable. And one way to make it more predictable is, again, to go back to fiscal policy rules, which is very complicated to do. So there, I see more of a challenge rather than the debt itself, because as Benoit argued, central banks can do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of making sure that even very high level of debts are actually sustainable. And so my answer to Benoit is actually a question to him. Does he really argue that actually we should make sure that fiscal policy is the main transmission channel of monetary policy? And I'll stop there.
Adam, if you want to get to questions, that's fine. Otherwise, I'd make a very brief point. Either way, though, let me know.
Let me ask Agnès, and if not, then I'll turn to you, Jason.
Great.
Thank you. Very quickly, because this was excellent comments. Thanks a lot. On Jason, an obvious difference between the euro area and the US is that in the euro area, we have 19 small uncoordinated governments, whereas there is one central bank. Hence, I would not, perhaps if you call the central bank as a leader in case of a crisis, it's more acceptable than a political actor. And what we need is some leadership to coordinate all this. And this is what the ECB has tried to do by words. But what we are lacking is really a coordinating device. But I would put the ECB, perhaps on the top of monetary policy, there is a leadership, a coordinating role for the ECB, which we have not organized yet. But still, so this would happen only in exceptional periods where we have a shortage of aggregate demand, and the ECB is missing its inflation target. However, if we talk about our star, what we say in the report, it's a global issue. So then you have to go for really international. And so we try to put some suggestions in terms of reducing uncertainties in the world. For instance, we have an occasion now with global vaccination, which would reduce by a very large extent the uncertainties for the years to come. So this is really a global issue. So even if the euro area did it right to raise the R star, it may not achieve that if there is still excess savings elsewhere in the world. Now, on Benoit, maybe Elga would like to come back on this, because there's a chapter about yield curve control and the difficulty in exiting these events in the past. So without going through a period of excess inflation and some bumpy years. So it's not so easy. So I agree with what you say about the fact that there are various instruments, and in particular, long-term interest rates can be controlled. But then you said the central bank can be very smart on the way out, as smart up as it was down. But in the past, we don't have a lot of positive experience to rely on. Thank you.
Thank you. We have many good questions, but I'm going to go for a brief remark from Jason and a brief remark from Giancarlo, but they must be brief. Jason, please.
Yeah, just listening to Xavier, I distinguish between why you would want rules. One reason why you might want rules is policymakers are biased. They're always inflating right before an election. A second reason is that they're inefficient, that they're just doing sort of crazy things, sometimes too much, too little. I'm not worried about bias. I have seen cases where there's too much fiscal responsibility and too much debt reduction, and I've seen cases where there's too little. So I don't think you want rules that constrain policymakers from moving in a certain direction. I think the purpose of the rules is to deal with the inefficiency, that sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little. And that's also, I think, the argument for central bank independence, is less to overcome the bias that policymakers have and more to have better technocratic decision-making to overcome the inefficiency. they might otherwise have.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Giancarlo?
Very quickly, thank you for the comments. And I just want to make two comments, one on Jason, one on Benoit. On Jason, I actually agree with what you're saying. I just want to make clear that in the report, we are trying, strategic complementarity is not an aspiration. Strategic complementarity is a fact. We are in a situation where M and F are strategic complement. And it's important to understand the way this works. The aspiration is to make it work better. Now we know that strict coordination is never a good way. Tobin has written on it, for example, but and many other later. The limit of coordination is very simple. You lose one instrument, so it's self-defeating. You think you coordinate two instruments, you go into coordination, you lose the monetary instrument. That was the concern with Tobin, which I think is still correct now. And this brings to my second comment to Benoit. We completely agree, actually. I'm sorry that you think that we don't believe in the importance of the balance sheet policies. We do. And we really think that it plays an important role in bringing us to any desirable state. But we're asking the following question. Do we really think that we can survive if we adapt all our policymakers to a situation of low R-star, persistently high debt for the next 30 years? By the way, R-star will not be low there because clearly there will be default risk, inflation risk that will increase the effective interest rate. So we'll have some kind of escape routes that are not particularly desirable. But the question we are posing is, given the gravity of the situation, do we really believe that we can adapt all our policies to the new normal and get away with it and be happy and have decades of control stability? I think it would be important to see whether there is one path, one chance to go back to something where more instruments are there. And of course, may not be exactly the same normal as before, but a little bit higher resilience that we could aspire to.
Thank you, Giancarlo. With asking the patience of our 400-person audience, I'm going to try to gather questions in the Q&A. Several questions from distinguished colleagues are on the issue of R-star. How, and this was sort of mentioned by Xavier, but I think it needs a deeper dive. So as Ted Truman and others raise, how does the report say we should be raising R-star? Bernard Casey raises, if R-star is a consequence of secular stagnation, maybe there isn't that much policy can do to raise it. Catherine Mann comes back to the issue of fiscal choices. There are high multiplier fiscal choices that support private investment, but what is being implemented in this regard of accommodative policy to raise R-star? Athanasios Orphanides, sorry to rattle these off, but I think we want to get as many concepts straightened out here from the authors. The idea of raising R-star as a global public good, it may not be that simple, which again evokes some of the things Xavier said about wasteful government spending could raise R-star without enhancing productivity. And then Klaus Mausch raises the issue of distributional aspects that do we need redistribution in order to get R-star up as opposed to monetary and fiscal policies which support financial asset levels. This is a bundle of issues. I'd like to ask the authors of the report, starting with Elga or Agnès, to give us their take on this question of raising R-star, when and how is it good, what is fiscal policy doing about it, and so on.
Let me maybe start on a couple of proposals that essentially are closely connected with fiscal policy, but fiscal policy might not be the only part. And I mean, it's true, and we state that in the report as well, what Athanasios says that it's challenging to do this on a global level. It's not, we're not claiming that any of this is going to be easy, but we do think that we have a unique opportunity right now, because not only are central banks, led by the Fed, are reviewing their policy frameworks, but you also see the discussion intensifying around the conduct of fiscal rule, the fiscal policy space, and indeed fiscal rules more broadly. So in the report, we look at three well-known proposals to raise R**. One was the fact that you actually run some fiscal deficits that you are not aiming to cover with future primary surpluses. That would most likely mean that there is some temporary form of monetization of government debt. The second set of proposals is around using public investment spending, taking advantage of the current low borrowing costs in order to raise potential growth. And then the last idea is through the issuance of additional debt, you actually are expanding the supply of safe assets. You could also do that with other instruments, but issuing more government debt relative to the demand would help to reduce the scarcity premium that we currently see on government bonds. So those would be three possible avenues to pursue to raise R**.
Thank you, Elga. Would Agnès, Giancarlo, or Xavier like to come back in on this topic? Any aspect? Agnès.
Perhaps just a word about investment. So there's a huge avenue for investment in relation to global warming. And to the extent that the price of carbon would be set correctly, then these would be high return investments. So there is really a trigger. The government can do public investment, but as Xavier just said, there is a limit to what they can do as smart investment, actually. And but there is a leverage on the private investment through the global warming strategy. So it is really an avenue, and in a sense, we are lucky that at this juncture, interest rates are so low. And in Europe, it's coming to the shortage of safe assets. Probably there would be a need to shift the balance between national governments and the EU level, which has been done already. There's a first step with the new generation EU strategy, and so the idea to have more EU debt, less national debt, and potentially in the longer term, this is a way to issue more safe debt. Otherwise, after the crisis, since debt to GDP ratios are going to go in different directions at the country level, there's going to be a very strong incentive to reduce debt issuance.
Thank you. Benoit, you had suggested you also want to speak on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Two things. First, to Xavier, yes, I would agree that the main role of central banks today is to empower fiscal policy. That's for today. But later on, they will have to do much more, and they will have to find the right way to exit, and they will have to be agile and use all their instruments. And so they shouldn't rest on their laurels, and they should start thinking about the way they will do it. Second, on lifting R**, and a number of comments in the chat really emphasize coordination issues, which I think are key. Global coordination is impaired. It has been very much impaired over the last 4 years. I'm not elaborating why. And so it's very hard to see how, say, the G20 or even the IMF could kind of bring people together to create that joint effort to lift the global R**, because the institutions are very much weakened today. And in Europe, it's even more tricky because, as Agnès pointed out, you have 19 governments, you have a European plan, but you have conditionality to reforms in this European money. How do you make sure that the money is wisely spent? if when the Commission starts implementing conditionality, there will be a huge outcry, and people will say that they're not legitimate, they're not a political institution, and they are infringing on country sovereignty. And that will be very difficult to manage. And then you also have national fiscal plans. And today it's not about our star. It's not even a stimulus. It's just about helping people to keep their heads up of the water. It's about indemnifying people. So how do you change the structure of these national fiscal plans from a crisis management to reforms, productivity, and the like, in a coordinated way? That's going to be extremely difficult in Europe.
Thank you, Benoit. I realize there's more to say on this topic, but let me put forward some of the other good questions we've received. Richard Berner asks, all of you correctly and explicitly frame the challenges to monetary and fiscal policy from tail risk. Does addressing them create financial stability risks? Should we modify monetary fiscal policies or use macroprudential tools to mitigate them, or both? Let me suggest that maybe Xavier Debrun should start off by addressing this, and then maybe Elga.
Yes, so essentially the question is about whether all this is likely to threaten financial stability. Is that correct?
Yes, and what role, if we're coordinating monetary and fiscal with that in mind, should macroprudential be part of the coordination mix?
Well, I mean, macroprudential is obviously a chief instrument to actually, sort of address or mitigate any kind of tension you might observe between the macro stabilization role of central banks and their role and their task in preserving financial stability. The empirical evidence we have so far is that yes, macropru is kind of an instrument in itself. I mean, it's not completely independent from the rest, from monetary policy in particular, of course, but it does so far a pretty good job in mitigating these tensions. So of course, yes, macropru has to be part of the equation because it can actually, sort of in itself, just to borrow very loosely some of the language we have in the report, it could create or enable more monetary policy space. But to be honest with you, I'm not an expert in a macroprudential policy. So I will leave it there for now.
Elga, I mean, everybody has an opinion, but Elga and Benoit, both of you, given your past writings, I think would be best placed to respond to this question as well.
Yeah.
Xavier gets stuck because he's at the bank, so
yeah, thank you very much, Adam. So what I would say, it depends on whether it's done right, the coordination, or done wrong. If done wrongly, it could actually increase the risk of financial stability. But the aim of the proposal that we make in the report is exactly to avoid the tail risks, and those tail risks are obviously often either resulting from or resulting in major financial instabilities, such as, say, the euro sovereign debt crisis. So it very much depends whether you get it right or you get it wrong. And I would say the financial stability aspect of it that Dick rightly stresses is just reminding us how big the stakes are on getting this right.
Thank you, Elga. Benoit, anything you wish to add, or?
No, I guess that's part of what I wanted to suggest in my comments, that central banks have to use different instruments and to kind of gauge their fiscal and financial stability footprints, right? And we don't know that much about it. And I guess macroprudential, in a broad sense, is part of it, insofar as most of the macroprudential framework as it stands today is actually in the hands of central banks or bank supervisors, and they are close to central banks. Using macroprudential will be part of the discussion on how do we tighten monetary conditions when time is ripe, which is not today. Again, not today. Please don't do that today. But at some point, you'll have to do it. How do you tighten monetary conditions while not sending the financial system into turmoil? And for that, you will need different instruments, including macroprudential, of course.
If I may add a word on macroprudential policies, because I think there is a role for macroprudential policies already today, not just with the CCYB or things like that, but to follow very closely the housing market, because there is a risk that the combination of expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy with a constraint on consumption, this could fuel some increase in housing prices with potential bust at the end. So I think this is something that governments can really do already now to look at how housing prices are evolving, and to they have some tools, and we know that housing prices are a big variable, a very important variable to predict financial crisis.
Thank you. To close, I'm just going to ask the panel. We have a couple questions from Bamadev Sigdale and from Maria Afrin, sort of in the spirit of what Jason was saying, but from a developing country perspective. Given the political economy and the institutional structures there, how relevant are these, or how applicable, I should say, are these prospects for monetary fiscal coordination? Is it going to work, or is it going to blow up? I'm exaggerating their questions, but I mean, even though the focus of this report clearly was on at least G20, if not G7 economies, have any of you given any thoughts about the applicability of this set of recommendations to other institutional and developmental contexts? If the answer is no, that's fine.
No,
which is fine.
We can. Adam, it's I could come in on this. Adam, can you?
Yes, Giancarlo, go ahead.
Yeah. So no, we haven't really worked on it except in the negative sense. One thing that we are currently thinking more about is the fact that the whole report is about finding instruments, preserving instruments, and creating independent instruments. One of the problems of many emerging markets is the fact that some of the instruments may have been simply not credible, or may be put out of the table because, for example, currency substitution, financial dollarization, or in the case of monetary policy. So in a way, there is that aspect, how to recoup the instrument. There is also now, of course, the big elephant in the room, which is the external debt. So I guess next year, it goes back to what Benoit was saying, how to deal with an accumulation of debt that is like in general. But if I may finish with a positive note, I agree with Jason again that, and many other people, that coordination at global level is very difficult. But we should not underestimate the importance of today convergence of interest around COVID, the global pandemics, around climate change, and for many countries about aging. Those are in very important areas where investment can be there. Private markets may be reluctant to do it for many reasons, including the uncertainty that we face. And some kind of ultima ratio, to quote Merkel, ultima ratio, smart move by the government can go a long way, even without a totally coordinated, international policy.
Thank you, Giancarlo.
Finish.
Benoit, you have the last word on EMEs before we close.
Yeah. EMEs is really an interesting discussion, because when you look at what a number of countries have done this year, I mean, last year after the COVID crisis, they've actually borrowed from the author's playbook, and they've been using QE for the first time, many of them, which has helped them resist and be more resilient to a global shock. Usually when the global economy is hit by a global shock, EMEs see capital outflows, and then they have no choice but to raise rates, to tighten monetary policy, which makes the situation even worse from a domestic standpoint. And here they've been able to avoid that because they've started QE, and also governments have started issuing more in domestic currency, and that has created exactly the kind of positive complementarity that the report describes. And that's relatively new in the EME world. And I would like to just to suggest you to read BIS Bulletin number 32 by Ana Aguilar and Carlos Cantu, who really describes this episode in quite some length.
Thank you, Benoit. I agree that that has been one of the surprising phenomena and possibly happy phenomena of the crisis to see that trend. This gets us into new issues, which of course is part of what policy discussion has to do and should do. Please join me in thanking virtually, but sincerely, our two discussants, Jason Furman and Benoit Cœuré, are four authors of the 23rd Geneva Report on the world economy, Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, Elga Bartsch, Giancarlo Corsetti, and Xavier Debrun. My apologies on pronunciation. I just want to give a particular shout out to the editor, Ugo Panizza, and the authors once again for tackling in real time what is a critical issue. The Geneva Reports have a history of picking the right topics under Charles V. Blush and under Ugo Panizza as part of the CEPR, and I think they excelled again. Obviously, we have the Peterson Institute with the work of Blanchard, the recent paper by Furman and Summers, the recent paper by Orzak, Rubin, and Stiglitz, work on the Euro area by Pisani Ferri and Ubide, my own work in Japan and Europe. We're very conscious of this monetary fiscal interaction, and we look forward to working with CEPR, with these authors on continuing to make progress, because we do, as the title puts it, monetary and fiscal policy will either work or fail together in the current context of pandemic and secular stagnation. And even agreeing with Giancarlo and others that there is this hope of public investment in global public goods like climate change and vaccines. We're not there yet. So we have to keep working the institutions, the political economy, and the case for them. And so once again, my thanks to the ICMB, the CEPR, and my Peterson colleagues for bringing this to the fore. This meeting is adjourned.